Did you ever wonder? I do. Did you ever wonder why the sun always rises, but the stars never fall? Why dry land is never satisfied by water? And why fire never says enough?
Oh, the wonder of hearing from God. Oh, I had a dear friend. We went to their birthday party last night, and she was describing this new Bible study that she was going to that was based on Henry Blackaby's experiencing God. And she was talking about how difficult it was that really challenged her faith because, you know, she, although had a wonderful relationship with God, she felt and read the word and all those kind of things. She didn't feel like she would literally hear from God, as Henry Blackaby would point out in that series. And so, you know, as I was talking to her, I couldn't help but relate. You know, my wife used to tell me that same thing. I never hear from God like you do, Robbie. I never hear from God. And then one day we were driving. You may have heard me tell this story. And she said, you know, why we're teaching special needs ministries is God told me that that was going to be my ministry. And I said, whoa, almost stopped the car and said, wait a minute, you said you never hear from God. Well, I knew in my heart somehow that was going to be, you know, one day when I heard Adam Nunn's father speaking about special needs, I could just hear from God that, and so she did hear that would be our ministry. And of course, I explained to our friend that, you know, anytime you pick up the word and you begin to read it, that things jump out at you and all of a sudden you get an understanding that you didn't have. Where do you think that comes from? Or maybe last night you were looking at the sunset or something just jumped out at you as beautiful, a tree, a flower, whatever that may be. Who do you think that is? Well, it's absolutely God. And a conversational intimacy with God is something that is amazingly wonderful. And the more you experience it, the more you want to experience it, it's my opinion. But it has to be, like a relationship has to be pursued. It's got to be sought for with all our hearts and with all our souls and with all our mind, right? And so I can't help it. I was praying this morning about this whole conversation, and I decided to revisit, Deuteronomy 6, the famous passage, right, where hear, O Israel, that's where the Shema comes from. It's, the Shema starts in Deuteronomy 6:4, but the precursor to, or the verse before the Shema, which still is very much along the same lines, says, hear, therefore, O Israel, right? And so that idea of hearing is, guess who you're hearing, right? You're hearing God himself. And he's telling you, listen, right? And then he says, oh, Israel. And you may remember that Israel means to contend with God. And so all of those of us that want to hear from God, to some extent, you have to contend. You have to wrestle. And so I'm going to put it the way that Marlon Brando did, okay? Because he was trying to have class.
I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody.
Right? So how cool is it that God gives us those directions so clearly in a Deuteronomy 6 when he says, hear therefore, O Israel, are you God contender, so you could be somebody? It says, observe to do, or what actually that would read, in my opinion, if you translate those words, is keep, right? And you might remember in the 119th Psalm how many times they were challenged to keep his word in so many different ways, and that's cherish it and preserve it and all those things. Why? So that you can do it, right? And that's obedience. Like, if you love me, you're going to keep my commandments. And it says why? Because, it'll be well with you, and that you may increase mightily as the Lord, the God of thy fathers, has promised thee in the land that floweth with milk and honey. And then comes the famous Shema, where it says again, hear, O you contenders, hear, O Israel. The Lord our God is one Lord. And that idea of ahad. And so I've dug into that ahad again today. And the word one means so many different things. And it's so spectacular, especially when you got the 3 in 1. But also, interestingly, if you dig deep into that word, it can also mean the way. Like, there's one way. And when you hear ahad, you can hear the aleph, which is clearly the Father, and then you can hear had, which actually means sharp, like a sharp sword. In Proverbs, when they're talking about a sharp two-edged sword, that's hot. And so it's the Father sword, so to speak, is also the idea of one. And when you think about what you're supposed to be doing according to the Shema, you're supposed to be listening. But what are we listening for? The way, right? And the way to the Father is what? Jesus. in so many different ways, but it's a beautiful thing that, from my experience, to ask God questions, especially about the scriptures, right? You read the scripture, you can't understand it, and you just go, and then you listen for the answers. And then you've got to cherish it, that idea of keeping, that when you hear his word, then, don't discount it, because it doesn't, you're like, I'm not sure I really heard. That's not really God. When you begin to understand that that's God's voice, now you've heard something really, really precious. And it's like your Father has come home. And when you hear from God, whether it's in the scriptures or in prayer, where you ask him specific questions and he answers, then it's like the Father has come home. And that means that you are in present time with him in prayer, like especially when you're in prayer, when you're in the scriptures, that in order to hear from God, you have to be in the same moment with him, which has to do with the letter Kuf. So you're in time and space and proximity with him. And you might even notice that time stands still. I often talk about that the more you can get into prayer and spend time with God, the more that you experience that. And even this morning, as I was studying this word ahad, and I was studying the idea of to keep his word and to listen to his word, and what a critical portion of that life, my life really is, because to me, to listen for God, whether that's when you're out there looking at nature, or you're listening in prayer, or you're listening while you're in his word, all of the above, it's like pray without ceasing. Because anytime that you can hear from God, it's like Dad has come home, and oh my goodness, what that does for your life, and what that does to show you what the way really is, especially in circumstances when you really need it. It's amazing when you've been fostering that relationship and you can hear clearly, okay, this is the path I need to go. How amazing is that? Yes, the wonder of hearing from God.
Did you ever wonder? I do.